Welcome to the Elements of Deep Sea Mining. I'm Eric Young. Today is an episode that you don't want to miss. I'm joined by Michael Clarke, the environmental manager at the Metals Company, one of the most prominent players in deep sea mining. Over the past 6 years, Mike has led a massive environmental baseline study in the Clarke and Clipperton zone, a $250 million effort involving dozens of global research institutions. We talk about how that research was designed, what it actually looks like to study environmental impact 4 kilometers deep and 5 kilometers from shore. Mike gets into what results they have around noise, sediment, plumes, and zones of impact. Mike has a deep background in marine biological research as well as impact analysis, and it was great to get his view of decision-making in situations of trade-offs.
And what we are asking of a regulator, be that the ISA or be that a national regulator, whoever's making the decision, you're asking them, do the social benefits of this project outweigh the environmental impact?
If you care about the truth behind deep sea mining, whether to support it or to stop it, you need to understand the science from the inside. I should also note that after this episode was recorded, Mike and the Metals Company did submit an application for commercial recovery of deep sea minerals to the United States government for a recovery permit in international waters. Obviously, this is big news for the international deep sea mining picture, and Mike and I do not get into it in this episode. We stick to discussing their environmental program, giving you the details on that. I hope to cover the more current events from the Metals Company and others in future episodes. Without further ado, I bring you Michael Clarke. Michael Clarke, thanks for being here.
Thanks a lot, Eric, and thanks for inviting me to join the podcast. I really enjoy what you're doing.
Great. So then let's start with your story, your background. Where do you come from, and what did you do before getting involved in deep sea mining, and how did that get you to where you are now?
All right, so I'm originally from the UK, from Liverpool, although I live on the east coast of Australia now. And I've been in the field of environmental sciences for over 30 years now. It all started when I did an undergraduate degree in applied biology at Liverpool. And as part of that degree, we had to go out and do work experience. And I actually worked for Thames Water Authority down in London for 12 months. And I was a fisheries biologist with Thames Water. And I spent a great summer on the Thames at Molesley Lock, right by Hampton Court, trying to capture salmon that we were trying to reintroduce into the Thames at that time, believe it or not. So they'd spend hundreds of thousands of dollars dumping salmon smolts, which are young salmon, into the river. And they're anadromous fish, so they'd swim out to the sea, mature, and out of the 10,000 they'd release each year, you'd be lucky to get 1 or 2 back. And that was my job, to catch the 1 or 2 that came back. So it was a great job. The whole program failed. They've stopped doing it now because it was very expensive, very little reward. But that was my first introduction to conservation, ecology, and conservation projects. After that, I was a tour guide for a couple of years in the Himalayas for an adventure travel company, which was fun. Did Everest Base Camp a few times. Also went down the Amazon a few times. That was really interesting.
I feel like this actually, when I speak with people involved in deep sea mining, it's kind of like it's a bit of a new adventurous industry. So it's actually, you're not the first person who has said that they've kind of taken a route through the mountains, through this kind of adventurous explorer background to get to here. Sorry.
Yeah, I saw your podcast with Lars. And he's got a similar background. He's got a similar background. Yeah. So look, after that, I went to the University of Texas in the States and did a master's degree there. I was funded by the US Army Corps of Engineers to study zebra mussels, which are invasive species that were introduced into the Great Lakes from the Caspian Sea and in the ballast of ships. And part of my master's was to develop a non-chemical means of controlling zebra mussels, because like with any introduced species, you introduce them into a new area with no predators and populations explode, and they were shutting down nuclear power stations on the Great Lakes at the time. So it was a real issue for about 5 or 6 years.
Sorry to interrupt on that note, but actually, I'm from a small town in central Canada, and we have just now a zebra mussel issue. And so this summer, they put out a big physical barrier for the zebra mussels, and then the first storm blew that away. And so,
Wow.
I don't know. Were you successful in that project on controlling zebra mussels?
Yeah, look, so we came up with a whole management regime, whereas, so what they were doing is in the winter, they would lower the water in the entrainment bays that were feeding the nuclear power stations. And it turns out they're very intolerant of freezing temperatures, so they just all freeze and die and drop off. But then you'd have to do that every year as part of a management strategy. But they were looking for a non-chemical means of managing them. So, yeah, that was really interesting. And then that kind of developed into a PhD, where I went and worked on mitolid mussels, which is a marine species which has abyssal attachment, just like the zebra mussels do. So that was a marine physiological experiment. And then I graduated from the University of Texas with a PhD in environmental management. Following that, I got a postdoc, was supported by a grant from the Darwin Initiative for the Survival of Species, and this was to map marine turtle nesting sites on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt on the Sinai Peninsula. So I actually spent 3 years in Egypt, basically camping out with the Bedouin, going up and down the Sinai coastline on a 4x4 with a team of Egyptians. And that was a real experience. So long, long time ago. Spent a lot of time right on the border with Israel in Rafah and El Arish. So yeah, different part of the world these days. And then after that, I moved to the States and worked for the California state government, removing dams from creeks along the California coast, so that anadromous steelhead trout, which are related to salmon, could get back into the creeks and spawn. So what that project was in the 20s and 30s, a lot of irrigation dams have been built on the creeks, and they'd stopped these anadromous fish from spawning, so they were now critically endangered. And we were identifying where these dams were, taking them out, and then building fish ladders so the anadromous fish could get back up to the headwaters where they spawn. So basically, I've got a really strong record in conservation biology, and I would not be involved in an industry or with a company that didn't have a strong conservation ethic because of that. So, yeah, that's what I bring to TMC.
And varied and all over the world. Kind of interesting how many different locations and different species you have specialized in. Okay, so then from opening waterways in California, where did you go next?
I then moved to Australia then, and went into industry and became a consultant. And for the last 20 years, I've been doing environmental impact assessments for large infrastructure projects. And I'm actually a certified environmental impact assessor with the Environmental Institute of Australia and New Zealand. So I've worked on large hydropower projects in Africa, in South Sudan, Uganda. I've worked on large hydropower projects in Myanmar and Pakistan, infrastructure projects in Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, transmission lines in Afghanistan and Vietnam. And then in the latter part of that part of my life, I was working on terrestrial mining projects in Australia and Indonesia. So my last role before joining the metals company was as lead environmental impact assessor for a copper mine on the Indonesian island of Sumbawa. And this is really interesting because this copper mine was contemplating deep sea tailings placements. So I'm not sure if you're aware what that is, but basically all the tailings and all the processing water and all the processing chemicals get put into a pipe. They get shipped to the shore, and then they get dumped in the sea at 1,000 meters in the coastal waters. And what I was doing at the time was all the fisheries surveys that were required, before, all the baseline surveys that were required before this happened. And it was during this time that I received a call from a recruiter that was hired by the metals company. And the recruiter asked me if I was interested in being a environmental manager for a mining company. My first kind of response was no, that's already what I'm doing. I'm working for Vale, which is the biggest mining company in the world. Why would I want to go and work for a little startup, you know? But she said, oh, this is a bit different. This is deep sea mining, which I'd never heard of before. So I did a bit of research into it. And the more I looked into what the metals company were proposing, the more it became evident to me that what they were proposing was a much better solution and than what was happening in Indonesia, than what we were planning on the island of Sumbawa. And, you know, the conservation biologist in me thought, well, you know, why would you be doing this in Indonesia, in Wallacea, you know, one of the most biodiverse places on Earth, when you could do it at the bottom of the ocean, where it's less diverse, less people, there's less pressures. It just made sense to me. Yeah, so that's how I ended up working for the metals company.
And how long ago was that you started with TMC?
I've been with TMC 5 years now. So I took the job at TMC, and now I head up a team of 8 very talented scientists, all of which have got PhDs in different aspects of marine biology, oceanography, and marine ecology. We've been implementing the baseline studies and the collector test monitoring for, it's more than 5 years now, it's coming up to 6 years. This program has cost TMC $250 million, which for a marine biology research program is a huge amount of money. And you really do have to take, whatever you think of TMC, you have to take your hat off to them to actually backing the science to, you know, to that tune. You know, it's the largest integrated environmental study that's ever been conducted in the Eastern Pacific. And it's a really exciting time to be involved and be with the company at the moment, because all this empirical data that we've been collecting over the last decade or so is now all coming together, and we're starting to analyze it and getting some real answers to some of the most pressing questions that have been asked of deep sea mining. So it's a really great time to be with the company.
Fascinating. Okay, so I want you to walk us through kind of what you guys do and how you do it before we get into the results. But I'm going to start with this kind of abstract question that I ask everybody, which is, and I think you'll have an interesting take on this, having worked in so many conservation as well as where conservation meets industry. But how do you approach decision making? How do you think of decision making when we are balancing trade-offs across different value categories? How do you balance, you know, things like just environmental value versus the benefit that comes out of some of these projects, things like that?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think what we all need to do, you know, if we're going to be part of the conversation about deep sea mining, is we need to educate ourselves on what these trade-offs are. I mean, there's a lot of people who are engaged in this debate that are solely focused on the environmental impacts with zero regard to what's happening on land-based mines, zero regard to the benefits that deep sea mining could bring to our sponsoring states like Nauru. And also, Lars touched on this on the podcast you did with him, the repercussions of not acting swiftly to address climate change. You know, these are all the other parts of the deep sea mining, debate. And this question goes to the heart of environmental impact assessment, you know, which obviously is my profession. What we are asking of a regulator, be that the ISA or be that a national regulator, whoever's making the decision, you're asking them, do the social benefits of this project outweigh the environmental impacts? And fundamentally, that's the question that they're answering, right? And it's a multifaceted question. So, like, you know, on the social side, a regulator must consider things like, you know, geopolitical issues, like supply chains, competition from other countries. What are the manufacturing needs of that country? What are the impacts from the current sources where they're getting the metals from? How committed is that government to the green transition, and how can they support it? The jobs that we created, the educational opportunities, the taxes, the revenue, all these factors need to go into that decision. And, I'm not qualified to make that decision because I only see the environmental part. But neither are most of the people who are involved in this conversation. And I think we all really do need to educate ourselves on the whole issue. It's like a systems approach, just as Lars was talking about, rather than just focusing on one aspect of it. Because you can't make an educated decision if you just focus on the one aspect.
But then your role is to be in that one aspect. So if I'm hearing you right, you're saying that if you're going to have opinions on this topic, then those should be informed from the kind of full perspective, taking all of the various values into account. And those opinions should be educated with the best information from the detailed sectors. And no one's going to be, I think I'm putting more words into your mouth than you said, but no one's going to be an expert on all of the different aspects. So then your role is to kind of drill down into the environmental aspect and feed that into the decision-making machine.
Absolutely. My role as an environmental impact assessor is to quantify the baseline, quantify the impacts, do an environmental impact assessment, write that up into a document, and then hand it to the decision makers, who are the people who presumably do have that kind of systems or global view of all the relevant issues, so that they can make an informed decision. But just making that informed decision based on the environmental impacts alone, that's not how these decisions should be made.
Great. Okay, so then let's get into how you go about kind of putting that information into their hands. So kind of talk us through the scope of the environmental work that you do at the metals company. How many people, organizations are involved, how it actually gets done. What are the technical challenges of working in that environment? Just walk us through what it looks like.
All right, look, I'll briefly go through what's involved in an environmental impact assessment, and I'll give you some detail about how we've kind of had to modify that for, the deep sea and the first deep sea mining project. So as I say, I've been doing EIAs all over the world for over 30 years. And as we just discussed, the reason you would do an EIA is to provide a decision maker with the information they need to make an informed decision. So the whole EIA process usually starts with a scoping exercise. So this is where you look at the proposed project, you look at the receiving environments, and you actually identify where those points of interaction may be between the activities that you're proposing and the receptors in the environment. So they then draw up a scope of work of the studies you need to basically characterize the baseline and characterize the different impacts and risks. And you put together a team and you go out and you do those baseline studies. In the case of deep sea mining, the process was a little bit different in that we had to do a collector test as well. We actually had to test the system. And this is because there's no history in deep sea mining. In terrestrial mining, they've been doing it for 1,000 years. The risks are well known, the impacts are well known. That wasn't the case for a deep sea mining project. So we actually had to go and build a prototype collector and go out and test it. Once you've identified where your impacts are, then you come up with mitigation measures to reduce that risk to an acceptable level. And those mitigation measures are written up in an environmental management monitoring plan, which is basically a book that you give to the people in the field and say, this is how you implement these measures to minimize the risks. That's implemented, and then there's an ongoing process of monitoring to make sure that your environmental outcomes are actually being reached. For our project, for the NORI project, we've implemented 22 campaigns out to the Clarion-Clipperton zone over the past 12 years. Some of those, on all of those campaigns, we collected some sort of environmental data, be that oceanographic data, deploying of oceanographic moorings. But each of these campaigns costs about $10 million to mobilize. So you can see where that $250 million figure came from. For each campaign costs about that much.
Yeah, so explain that a little bit for people who kind of can't picture this. So a campaign is you load up a bunch of engineers and scientists onto a big ship and drive exactly how far out into the ocean. Like, what does this kind of look like in terms of logistics?
Great question. So basically, we mobilized all our campaigns from San Diego. So the first thing you have to do is you have to secure a suitable research vessel or a suitable platform which you can do research from. And then you have to decide what scientific studies you're going to do when you're offshore. So for the environmental work, there's a lot of box coring. So these are big metal boxes you drop over the side of the vessel on a rope. They sink to the seabed. They sink into the sediment. And then you pull it up, you come up with a big chunk of sediment with all the nodules on top and all the organisms that are associated with those nodules. And then you hand that over to the scientists and they sift through the nodules, the animals, and identify them and categorize them, etc. Or we use a multi-core, which is a similar concept, but they're actually lengths of pipe. And this is to get a profile through the sediment. And that's usually for geochemical work. You hand that and they measure pore water concentration, chemical concentration. We also have ROVs that go and take video footage of the seabed to count macrofauna. So you have to have a full ROV crew on board and ROV pilots. To do the box core and multi-core work, you have to have scientists who can identify the organisms that you're pulling up, which are few and far between. You have to have labs on board so that they can process all the data and process the samples once it's brought up to the surface. So that's where all the expenditure is. You load all that onto a ship. It usually takes about 5 days to get everything together. And then you go 5 days steam into the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The Clarion-Clipperton Zone is literally the middle of nowhere. You can't. If there was an accident offshore, you couldn't get a helicopter out there. It's outside the range of any helicopters.
Oh, wow.
So if there's any issues, you have to turn the ship around and head back. And we actually operated. The reason, go on.
And you're just one, because I've always are you just one ship? There's no support vessels. You don't have a couple of faster boats that are ferrying people back and forth to the mainland. You're out there.
No, for most of the campaigns that we've done, it's been a single vessel. Yeah. When we were doing the collector test, we had the Hidden Gem, which is our production vessel. We also had a science support vessel. And we did have a supply vessel that was going back and forth as well. But that was only for about 3 of the 22 campaigns we've done, most of them. Yeah, you just go out there and that's it for 6 weeks. You're 6 weeks on site. You get all the work done. We do 12-hour shifts. It's a real industrial exercise. That's one of the reasons we've been able to collect so much data and get so much work done, is that it's run like a commercial operation. So we do a night shift and a day shift, and we just continually sample. And then all those samples are packaged up. They're flown to all the 4 corners of the earth, to all the different institutions that were on board. And they spend about the same amount of time processing those samples, identifying the organisms, doing all the geochemical analysis. We've had, because this was a brand new endeavor and there's no established commercial entities that do this kind of work like there is in the oil and gas industry, for example, we made a lot of partnerships with academia. And that was because there was really no option, but also because we wanted this data to be very transparent. Every academic organization that we have a contract with, there's a clause in that contract saying that they are free to publish any of the data in any way they see fit without any interference from TMC. And that's probably been evidence in some of the publications that have come out from the work that we've been doing.
That was going to be one of my questions, was of all the people on the boat, how many of them are working for TMC and how many other organizations?
So obviously there's the ship's crew, that look after the running of the vessel, and that's about a third of the people. So usually there's about 60 to 80 people on board the vessel. So about a third of that is the ship's crew. And then about half are from the academic institutions that we've engaged. And there's only usually a handful of TMC people. There's usually only about 3 or 4 TMC people on board. And we're just there to facilitate everybody else to do their work. So I went out on a campaign and I was the client liaison. So I liaised between the academic institutions and TMC. So, if they had a problem or they said this is outside the scope of what we promised to do, I'd sort all those issues out. Yeah.
Well, that's fascinating. That sounds that sounds like a incredible logistical and managerial task to get. I can't actually imagine getting a whole bunch of research institutions to work together on a compressed timescale like that. I think that would be.
It was a nightmare. I will freely admit that, Eric. It was an absolute nightmare. Because we have definite start and finish dates, and we have a definite scope of work that we've got to get finished. So getting all those different parties to get the work done, the amount of time we've got is very challenging. But just examples of some of the institutions that have been out in our campaigns and collected data for us: the Natural History Museum in the UK, University of Leeds, Heriot-Watt University in Scotland, University of Hawaii, University of Texas, Florida State University, University of Maryland, liaised with government agencies such as CSIRO, which is the scientific arm of the Australian government, and then commercial entities as well, such as DHI, the Danish Hydrological Institute, who did a lot of plume modelling for us. So, to get the expertise that we needed, we had to, spread the net far and wide to get the people that were required to do this.
And a lot of this is research work that is kind of, some of it, I guess, is of a kind that has been done before, and then some of it is totally new. Is that right? Like, it's not like you're just doing this environmental assessment that has been done over there previously and now doing it here and taking these samples here. So I'm just wondering if there's any aspects of the technical developments that you needed to do to make this happen at all.
So this is really interesting because this was always a bit of a friction point between ourselves and the academics. So obviously the academics have their area of expertise. They want to identify everything. They want to, find new species. What we're out there for, we're out there to answer relevant questions associated with the risks of deep sea mining. So, it was a constant battle. They wanted to answer question A, but we wanted question B answered. So it was trying to find that middle ground. How can you guys still get the research done that you want to get done? But how do we answer our questions to, be able to categorize the risks associated with what we're proposing? And that's my job, is to basically formulate those questions and then find the right people and the right researchers that can answer those questions. And in oil and gas, that's a well-established, field. We can go to any oil and gas consultant and all those questions will have been asked before, and they will have protocols and systems in place. And you can just basically buy those expertise off the shelf. This is brand new. We had to plug and play expertise from different institutions and different consultants in order to pull a program together that would answer the questions. And that's one of the reasons it's cost so much, one of the reasons it's taken so long. But it's all coming together now, and we are getting the answers that we needed. But it was an effort. It was a real effort.
Yeah. So you're taking, in terms of designing the environmental program, you're kind of taking the kind of questions that you knew you needed to answer from these big projects that you have worked on in the past. So you're taking things from onshore mining projects. I guess, like you mentioned, the offshore oil industry, these are relevant things that you would borrow from. And then you're trying to brainstorm, like, what are the things that we need to specifically answer for this in order to give the decision makers a reasonable idea of what's going to happen. So, just where, I guess, put some more meat on the bones of like how you design this program before you go out to sea.
Well, this is where a scoping study is so important, right? So in the scoping study, you basically say, okay, hypothetically, what does this project look like? Because you haven't developed the project yet. Okay, we're going to have a mining machine crawling along the bottom of the ocean. We all anticipated that was going to create a plume, so we need to do plume monitoring. Mm-hmm. This mining machine is going to pick up nodules. Nodules are going to have organisms on them. We need to know what those organisms are. Okay, we need a biologist to do that. We're going to create noise. We need a sound model. We're going to create a midwater plume if we use this particular system. So we need to know what's in the pelagic part of the system. So we pulled all that together and got a framework, and then we went out. We wrote RFPs, requests for proposals, and sent it out to the handful of people in each of these areas that we thought would be able to do the work. And we got a good response. A lot of the academics they were really attracted by this new area and by the funding that we were offering. So, it was like we got them on board. But, in each field, there's probably 2 or 3 people that can actually do that work. So pulling the right people together was a real mission.
And then I guess once you start, then you're updating as you go. So you start thinking, okay, we've got plumes, we've got noise issues, we've got biodiversity, ecology questions, and then as you learn more, you update with additional research questions and additional aspects.
Yeah, you'll add additional studies, or you'll find out things that you thought were going to work just didn't work, so you have to do it a different way. A good example of that is we were doing what we call mock nest tows, which is basically a big net that you tow at different depths, and you collect the pelagic organisms at a whole strata at different depths through the water column. And we did some of the deepest tows that have ever been done in the Pacific Ocean, and that was really challenging because there's only about 3 of these nets in the world, and they have to come with a whole team of technicians, and they always have all kinds of problems with them. Mm-hmm. So there's constant issues. And then we had the extra curveball is we did all this in the middle of COVID. So when COVID struck in 2020, we were right in the middle of our baseline campaigns, and we had to make the decision: do we carry on, or do we stop and put our program behind by how many years COVID was going to last? It turned out we'd have put ourselves behind by about 3 or 4 years at least. So we made the decision to carry on through COVID. Now, if you think about the logistical challenge of that, you're flying 80 people in from all different parts of the world, and then you're putting them in a tin can together for 6 weeks, and you're saying, do not infect each other. And as I said before, because we are 5 days offshore and out of range of any helicopters, if anybody had got really ill, we would have had to have turned that boat round and lost the $10 million we invested in it and come back to shore. So we had very, very strict COVID quarantine regulations in place. You had to quarantine before you got on the plane from your home port. You had to quarantine when you were in San Diego. You had to quarantine on the ship out to the site. And only after you'd been out of contact with everybody else for about 3 weeks, we were allowed contact. And then when you came back, you had to go to quarantine again. And then because I was from Australia, I was living in Australia, I then got back to Australia and then I had to do 2 weeks quarantine in Australia in a hotel room. So that, I think, that's one of the biggest accomplishments of this whole thing, is being able to operate through COVID. And I think we did about 7 or 8 campaigns during COVID, and we didn't have one single case on our campaigns, which is just phenomenal.
Yeah. I guess, on the one hand, you are isolated out there, so as long as everything goes well. But then, now that you mention it, it's interesting to think back to that beginning time of COVID and how much uncertainty there was. And it was cruise ships that were making headlines. So I guess going out on a ship, a whole bunch of other people would have been nerve-wracking. Let's pivot now to some of your results. So how far along are you in this program? Are you guys coming to the end, and what have you learned, and what's interesting to share?
Yeah. So like the results, we've got really exciting results because we've got really robust data, and I guess there's about half a dozen issues that people are concerned about with deep sea mining, and a lot of them center around the plumes, which we'll go into. But one of them, one of the big concerns has also been noise. So what we did as part of the EIA is we had moorings out there with hydrophones on them. We had floating moorings to get a baseline of the soundscape in the ocean in NORI D and the CCZ. And we identified whales passing through, dolphins, etc. So we got a good baseline of what was there. But then when we did our collector tests, we actually had a set of hydrophones on moorings at different distances away from the collector test. And from that empirical data, we got SAMS, the Scottish Marine Institute, to develop a noise model. And it was really interesting. Most of the noise of our system actually comes from the ships when they're operating on dynamic positioning. So they have thrusters that keep them in one place. And that's where most of the noise comes from. There's very little noise from the riser pipe. There's very little noise from the collector on the seabed. It's all from the vessels. So
and is that vessel
Sure.
noise reaching the seafloor? Even how deep is this? This is 4 kilometers where you guys are.
Well, the vessel noise is all at the surface, right? At the seabed, the only source of noise you've got is the vehicle and a small amount of noise from the pipe.
Yeah. And when you say that most of the noise comes from the vessel, are you saying that at the seabed you're hearing the vessel noise, or
no?
So anywhere in the system, that's the only place that's really producing the large volumes?
Yeah, I mean the real noise issues are at the surface because in the surface waters where you've got receptors such as whales and dolphins, that might be impacted by noise. But what our model says is that there's a radius around our production vehicle of about 3.5 kilometers, and within that radius, we're getting decibels above about 120 decibels, and that has been identified as a threshold at which migrating whales may deviate from their course to get around, to avoid a noise. But that's no different from a lot of other vessels that are operating around the world that use dynamic positioning. So, from our perspective, that's not a big issue. Not for our initial operations. Now, if you had multiple operations operating right through the CCZ, then you'd have to talk about cumulative impacts. But that's why we've got a regulator. That's their job, is to manage how many licenses they give out and how much cumulative noise can be generated and what's acceptable. But from a single project perspective, from a site-specific EIA, we don't classify the noise that's being generated as a significant issue. So that's one of the potential impacts that we've classified as non-significant at a site scale, at the scale of this project.
Mm-hmm. And what about the noise at the sea floor? So I'm trying to think of the questions that people are going to want me to ask you. So the collector vehicle is going to make noise, and that environment down there is, I guess, naturally has little noise. But we also maybe don't know what the noise impact or what the noise impacts on the organisms would be as compared to whales, where we have kind of some idea of how noise affects their behavior.
So you've got to think, and this is the beauty of doing an impact assessment, because you've got to think about the scale, right? So we have basically got like a big Dyson vacuum cleaner crawling along the seabed, which is operated all by electric motors. So everything's electric, so it's actually inherently quite quiet. So the actual sound footprint of that vehicle on the seabed is quite small. You will have a radius around it, but you think, it'll be a few hundred meters, and you think about, yes, some organisms will hear us coming, but in the big scale of things, is that likely to be significant? And the answer is no.
Yeah, well, I suppose that few hundred meters is is the area that you are kind of disturbing, like you're disturbing this with noise, but then you're going to come by with the collector and really you're going to collect all the hard surfaces in the environment. So you are impacting in that area.
Yeah, we designate impact zones when we do our impact assessments. And what our goal is when we develop our system and we develop our mining program is to contain all those impact zones to within the lease. Because that's what we're asking the regulator to do. We're asking the regulator to give us permission to cause impact within our lease. And the big goal for us is to make sure that none of those impact zones actually extend outside the lease. So what we're saying with noise,
I think that's a really helpful way a helpful thing to keep in mind is when you're thinking about where the significant impacts are for a mining operation, you have an area that you know you're disturbing, and then you're trying to keep the downstream impacts from spreading. And then, I mean, I guess if you compare that to land-based mining, like wherever you're digging, you're having absolute impact, and then you really want to minimize what happens with your tailings and the runoff and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. So on a terrestrial mine, the equivalent scenario would be, pollution of waterways, because then the impacts from your mine are actually leaving your site. Or air pollution, again, the impacts of your mine are then leaving your site. So what we're trying to do is contain all those zones of impact. I'm not talking about zones of influence here, zones where we can demonstrate there's an impact to the mining site. Now, and the next question is, what's the difference between a zone of impact and the zone of influence? So a zone of influence is where you may be raising the ambient noise or the background noise above normal levels, but it's not, there's no discernible impact from that. Like a whale would not move from its migration route in response to that level of noise that you're generating. So that's a zone of influence rather than a zone of impact. So our goal is to keep all those zones of impact to within the lease, and then to minimize the size of those zones within the lease as well.
Interesting. Just give me a second. I need to put a sweater on, and then we can move on from noise.
Sure.
I turned off the heater to stop the fan noise, and then the temperature is dropping in my room here. Great. Yeah. So then moving off of noise, actually, where's the next impact?
All right. So let's talk about the plume. So this is the big one that everyone is really concerned about. So there's basically four components to the plume story. So there's the benthic plume, which is the sediments that we disturb on the seabed. It goes through the collector vehicle, comes out the back of the collector vehicle, and it forms a plume behind the collector vehicle. As that sediment settles back to the seabed, it then forms a sedimentation footprint. This sedimentation can be in the tracks that you've disturbed, that you've collected nodules from, but it could also be outside the tracks. It could cover areas that haven't been mined. And the fear has always been that the size of this sedimentation footprint would be tens of thousands of kilometers. So your actual mining footprint would be orders of magnitude bigger than the area that you collected the nodules from. That was always been one of the concerns.
And I guess it's important to say that this is an environment that's characterized by incredibly low natural sedimentation. So one of the concerns about having a sediment impact is that it's ecosystems that have very little sediment naturally.
Well, that's a common narrative, yes, because the actual natural rate of sedimentation from the surface is very low. But what's usually left out of that discussion and that argument is there's lots of sediment movement on the seabed. There's lots of benthic storms on the seabed, so sediment gets whipped up and relocated a lot. So to think that these organisms are only exposed, to a fraction of a millimeter a year of sediment that drops through the water column to the seabed is not really a true representation of what's going on there. They're all being exposed to sediment all the time as it gets moved around and storms pass through, etc., etc. That's what we found. We've got evidence to demonstrate that.
Well, I've never heard of a benthic storm, so I'm picturing now like uh, similar to a sandstorm moving across a desert. But what causes uh, that? I mean, what causes the water movement at that depth?
Yeah, but the water moves on the seabed as well. You know, the currents on the seabed are influenced by eddies that pass through the area, or tidal influences. So there is water movement. It usually sloshes back and forth. It's not directional for any extended length of time, which is what we found as well from some of the moorings we had down at 4,000 meters. But there is, large volumes of water moving, which does stir up sediments. There's also, there's also turbidity currents that form naturally. Like you'll get areas that subside and they'll form a turbidity current that can flow, and they form natural turbidites. So there's lots of natural movement of sediment on the seabed. So animals do get exposed to sedimentation at some level, in addition to what's coming through the water column from the surface.
Interesting. Okay. So I sidetracked you from walking us through this. Yeah.
So the sedimentation footprint, and then we've got the midwater plume. So what the midwater plume is as our collector vehicle goes across the seabed, it picks up the nodules. We've become very, very efficient at separating the nodules from the sediment at the seabed. 95% of that sediment that goes into our collector vehicle goes out the back, and only 3 to 5% actually goes up the riser pipe, 4 kilometers vertically to the surface. And it's separated from the nodules on the surface vessel. So that 3 to 4% of sediment needs to be released back into the receiving environment. And this is the midwater plume. And the midwater plume has 2 components to it. It has a particulate component, which is the sediment particles, but also potentially has a dissolved component. So because we are moving nodules up the pipe, and because they're being agitated all the time, there's a chance that those tiny nodule fragments could be reduced when they're released back into the water, and we get dissolved metals coming out. So we had to model the dissolved plume as well.
And the sediment is of a different material than the nodules. So the nodules, we don't have to get into how they form, but they largely form by precipitating out of the water, either above or below the seabed. But the nodules aren't just, or the sediment isn't just smaller fragments of nodules. It's actually a different material.
That's right. It's different composition. So what we've got in the midwater plume are fragment particles, are nodule particles, and then also a small amount of sediment as well. So and they behave differently. Like the nodule particles tend to be heavier than the sediment particles, so they come out the pipe and immediately start sinking to the seabed. So all that needs to be tracked, and we've developed some really sophisticated models to actually monitor these 4 different components. So I'll just go through the process you have to go through to actually develop one of these models. So first thing we did is we developed what we called a hindcast model. So this is predicting where we think the sediment and the plume will go based on the information we have before we've done a test. And that's a very crude model because you don't have much information at that time. You're using currents, you're using your best guess of the sinking velocity of the sediment particles. You don't know if flocculation's occurring, which is where the particles actually stick together to make bigger particles, which means they sink faster. So you don't know any of that when you do your hindcast model. But you make do with it. You go out and you do your collector tests, and during your collector test, you're collecting all kinds of information that then feeds back into that model. So then you end up with a verified model, a model that's been verified with empirical data. And you can tweak your model so that it's a better representation of what you observed in the field. And then you end up with a verified model, which then can be used to scale that model up to a forecast model for your operating system, for your commercial operating system. So that is, a very, that's a very complex process to go through that, and to verify your model's got to be verified with empirical data. Otherwise, it's basically useless. We also do lots of lab work to see how quickly sediment particles actually drop through the water column, to see that if they do flocculate, what that does, how that changes the dynamics, to see how quickly a nodule fragment will drop compared to a sediment particle. So all that lab work is put into your model as well. So the things that we include in our models, the different components, we include the discharge composition and concentration of our discharge, dilution rates, differential settling rates of different sized sediment particles, the degree that they flocculate, the currents, the discharge depth, the discharge water temperature, if upwelling is occurring, seasonality, and most important, which is left out of most models that have tried to predict how these plumes will behave, is our equipment design. We put an awful lot of time and effort into leaving as much sediment as we possibly can at the seabed. And Allseas, our engineering partners, are very, very good at that. So all those components have to go into a model. And we develop these multi-phase models that have been verified with data. And these are very different from some of the models that you see out there. Like a lot of the models are just particle tracking models, which basically say, if like there's one in that Blue Peril video, which basically says that we're going to impact the coastal waters of Hawaii. And all those models do is they say, if I drop a container load of ping pong balls in the Tomel lease, which is what this model says, will any of those ping pong balls reach Hawaii based on the ocean currents? Well, yeah, of course they will. You don't need a model to predict that. But they're not taking into account the characteristics of the plume, the settling rates, the characteristics of the sediment particles, flocculation. So, they're pretty useless, actually, in predicting anything.
Okay, so you've developed these models, and you then have verified them. And if I understand, you've also done test runs with the collector vehicles where you then somehow track the actual sediment flow that happens in reality and compare that to the model. So what have you kind of discovered? What are the impacts of these plumes?
Well, it's really interesting because back in the 1970s and 80s, when NOAA did testing of collector vehicles, they predicted
NOAA
that
is the U.S.
the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration in the United States. So it's like the scientific arm of the United States government.
Okay.
So they did a lot of studies back in the late 70s and early 80s when they were trying to get deep sea mining off the ground. And they actually produced a really, really good body of work about the impacts of deep sea mining. They did 5 years of baseline studies, and they also did 1 year of collector testing as well. And I've actually just spent a lot of time recently reading through all that information, and it's really, really good. There's a tendency to dismiss it because it's from 40 years ago, but a lot of good things happened 40 years ago. We did a lot of good science 40 years ago, and a lot of it stands up to scrutiny today. And one of the things that stands up to scrutiny is that they predicted that the sediment coming out the back of the collector vehicle would form a turbidity current. So this is basically the sediment particles, as they come out the back of the vehicle, are attracted to each other. So they form like a soup, for want of a better word, that rather than lofting up into the water column, where it can be dispersed by advection over large distances, it just follows the contours of the seabed. And because of that, most of the sediment that comes out the back of the collector vehicle settles very locally. And we actually measured the sedimentation footprint that was created during test mining. And 95% of the sediment settles within 1 to 2 kilometers of point of disturbance. And it's not just us who found this. MIT and GSR had very similar results. And that is very different from the conjecture that was, out there before we went and did our collector test, which basically speculated this would cover hundreds, if not thousands of square kilometers outside the mining site. But the thing is, it was all there in the NOAA report. They'd already said that this was going to happen. So I do find that commentary that, we were going to impact huge areas outside of the test mining field to be quite disingenuous, because all the data was there. You just had to look for it.
So when you say that 95% of the sediment settles within a few kilometers, do you quantify this in terms of like what depth of sediment that settles at certain distances from collection?
Yeah, absolutely. So we basically sampled on a gradient from the edge of the mining area. We collected box cores both before and after mining on a gradient of several kilometers away from the edge of the mining site. And what we found is basically sedimentation less than 5 millimeters really doesn't elicit a negative response in any of the benthic organisms that we were studying. More than 5 millimeters elicits what we call a pulse response. So some of the characteristics that we were quantifying basically went down. So that could be, could be the biodiversity, or it could be the density of that particular organism, or the community structure could change. But then what we found after 12 months, when we went out and sampled again, is a lot of those metrics have come back or we're starting to recover. So that's what we call a pulse response. So there's a temporary detrimental response. And this was also confirmed by that new SmartX paper that came out. They went back to the old SmartX site after 40 years, and they found that basically everything that was in the sedimentation footprint that actually hadn't been mined had recovered. And the only lingering impacts are actually in the mine site. So we're finding the same thing. So what this does, this is a really significant finding, and it really kind of irked me that this wasn't the angle that was taken when the SmartX results were reported by media. What this tells us now is we can, with a high degree of accuracy, demarcate the boundaries of our impacts, or of our long-term impacts. They're the edge of the directly mined area, because everything that isn't mined, that is covered with sediment, looks like it comes back after a number of years. So that's a major finding.
Interesting. And I suppose, again, then you would raise this question of cumulative. So if you get a pulse response from one mining operation, if you surround an area with mining operations, then you're obviously going to have this cumulative sediment that's going to build on itself.
Well, if those sedimentation footprints overlapped, then yes, but the blocks are so big, that's unlikely to happen. But again, that's why we have a regulator. Those cumulative impacts, regulator would have to make sure, if it was an issue, that those mining leases were far enough apart that there wasn't that overlap of sedimentation.
Yeah, okay, so it's interesting what you said about this sediment, the benthic sediment, kind of forms a slurry and essentially stays separate from. I mean, I've seen this when a glacial river merges with a river that doesn't have that sediment. You can kind of see the demarcation line that these separate bodies of water stay separate. People have probably seen YouTube videos of divers in caves where water stays separate. What about the midwater plume or the release plume? Where is that going to go, and what do we know about that? Okay,
so the midwater plume, as I said before, this is the less than 5% of the sediment that goes up the pipe. We have a dewatering system on the surface vessel, and this separates the nodules from the sediment and the benthic water that's come up the pipe, and all that has to be released into the back into the receiving environment. So our system releases it at 2,000 meters. Now, the reason that we're releasing it at 2,000 meters is in the ocean, most of the life, most of the biomass is in the surface layers. It's in the productive area. It's in the productive layers. So, the top 200 meters, top 1,000 meters. Once you get down to 2,000 meters, and we've got evidence of this, we did some bioacoustic sampling, the biomass drops right off. So if you're going to release anywhere in the water column, it's probably at 2,000 meters because you've got the minimum biomass. You don't want to go any higher than that because you've got productive surface layers. And you don't want to go to the seabed because then the biodiversity starts going up again as you approach the seabed. So you actually want to release it at 2,000 meters. And, pelagic biologists such as Jeff Drazen from the University of Hawaii is actually on record saying that 2,000 meters is probably the right region to be releasing your midwater. So we've modeled that. And as I say, there's two components to it. There's the particulate plume, which is your sediment particles. And we've modeled that considering all those characteristics that I talked about before, such as flocculation, the differential settling rates. And what our model for our full-scale production system predicts is that 2 kilometers behind the point of discharge, you will not be able to measure the plume. It'll be back to background. You won't be able to measure it. It'll be so diluted. And the same for the dissolved plume as well. So right at the mouth of the pipe, you do get high levels of metals, but then within 2 kilometers, then you can't measure the back-to-back run. So what this tells us is, again, the conjecture that this midwater plume would, impact areas of tens of thousands of square kilometers is just not true. Within a couple of kilometers, the huge dilution effect of the Pacific Ocean has kicked in, and everything is so dilute that it just can't be measured.
Do we know what are the elements of concern in that? Like, is it things that are in the sediment, or is it these metals that are potentially being released from the nodules that would have the most risk?
Well, that's really interesting because it all depends what form the metals are in. Because metals in certain forms are bioavailable, which means they can be taken up into a biological system and go through the trophic levels. And that's the real concern for fisheries. Is there any bioaccumulation of metals? We're finding that most of, and this is still data that's yet to come in, we haven't finalized it yet, but what we're finding is that most of the metals are not in the bioavailable form when they're actually released into the seabed, into the water column. They dilute really quickly and they're not bioavailable. So that minimizes the risk. But we're still waiting on some data to come in from that. The risk from the particulates is that if you're a filter feeder, or you've got a respiratory tree, if you're a gelatinous organism, that you could become overwhelmed by the sediment sticking to your filter feeding apparatus or your respiratory apparatus. And that could either, cause mortality or it could certainly cause stress to the organism. But again, because that midwater plume dilutes so quickly, that will impact a small number of organisms in a very localized area. But in terms of it being a widespread impact, the data doesn't show that that's likely to be an issue.
Okay, well, I'm noticing the time, Mike, and I want to be mindful of your time. So I wonder if we can go a bit quickly through the kind of more, because I also have some questions kind of more generally about data sharing and other aspects of doing this research. But what else is there in the results that are kind of big headline items worth sharing? I guess one of the things that we hear a lot of is this concern over carbon release. I don't know if you guys have.
That's really interesting. I think that's just a big red herring, if I'm honest, Eric. So, it's true that the ocean is, a huge carbon sink, and it's responsible, for a huge amount of carbon sequestration. What what you're not informed of a lot of the time is most of that carbon sequestration is actually in the water column or in the sediments of the shallow parts of the ocean. Very little carbon sequestration actually happens in the deep ocean. And also, there's nothing we're doing, there's no pathways from 4,000 meters back to the surface other than up our riser pipe, where any disturbance of carbon could actually make its way back to the surface and contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, which is, that's been the claim. We've actually measured the emissions from our riser pipe, and they're very low. So every time that issue comes up, I cringe a little because it's in the literature that it's not likely to be an issue.
Yeah, okay. I guess we don't have to spend more time on that. What about lights? When I see your videos of your collector vehicle, it's got a headlight on it, and I kind of wonder why. I guess that's because it must be remotely piloted by an operator somewhere.
Yeah, it's to illuminate the video feed, so that we can see what's in front of us. So, the sources of light, we have a couple of headlights on the collector vehicle. Again, that radius of light it produces is really small. It's I actually did a calculation of it. The light pools somewhere between 20 to 30 meters around the collector vehicle. So in the big scale of things, it's a really small impact zone. We also have ROVs that go up and down that have lights on them. ROVs are used by researchers all the time with lights with no issues. And then the other source of light is on the surface from the vessels. There are some impacts of migrating birds, for example, being attracted to vessels in the darkness of the Pacific Ocean and flying into the infrastructure and doing themselves some damage. But again, that's an issue that would be relevant to any vessel, not just ours. So the light issues, I don't see that they are significant either, and that's what our assessment has turned out.
And then, I mean, the other major impact here is just removal of the substrate of the environment. So how do you look at that?
So it's a mining project, right? That's what you're there for, is to remove some substrate, right? What we're finding is most of the biodiversity is in the sediment, right? When you look at a core, most of the biodiversity is in the top few centimeters of the sediment. Now, there are nodule obligates that obviously, if you're taking the nodules, they will go up the pipe and they'll become, part of our resource. They're not coming back anytime soon in the directly mined areas. But the ISA's already accounted for this. This is why they've put nearly half the CCZ into protected areas. So, the theory is that there's, quite a homogeneous habitat on the seabed in terms of nodules. So if you protect areas with nodules in them, there's a very high likelihood that those organisms that are being impacted when you mine nodules in this area are also represented in the protected areas. And that's why they put over 50% of the CCZ into protection. And then also the other thing that you've got to keep in mind is that these blocks, we won't be mining all the block. You'd be lucky if you can mine 50% of a block. So what happens is that you end up with a fragmented habitat, which contains nodules and sediment-dominated areas, both of which are habitats that are naturally down there anyway. So there is actually opportunity to maintain connectivity across a mined block. And that's the things that we're thinking about as we do our mining plans. How do we maintain this connectivity across the block?
Why is it that you can't mine the entire area? Is it just the topography of the seabed?
Some of the block doesn't have nodules in it. Some of it is too steep. There are seamounts that you can't mine. Some areas we will choose to actually not mine because they might be ecologically sensitive. So there's lots of constraints. We do a constraints analysis on how much can be mined and how much can't. So,
and then I guess another question on that is, what do we know about? So your job is to study the area that the metals company has kind of been assigned, these blocks that you've been assigned to doing an environmental impact assessment of that location. And then what do you know about the areas just outside of that and the protected areas? Is there research going on in those areas also?
Well, the research in the APIs has been quite minimal up to this point, but when we develop our exploitation plan, it's a requirement, that it's done in a precautionary manner. And as part of that, what we would do is we would start off mining a very small area within our own block. And, say a small area, in the big scheme of things, it's an area that could keep us in production for several years. And in that time, we would have a monitoring program that does go outside into these APIs and start sampling there as well, so that we could demonstrate that the theory that what's in the block that we're mining is also well represented in these other areas is actually correct. So, the mining wouldn't expand until we've got information and demonstrated or verified where our claims are that we've made in our EIS.
Yeah. I guess this is a natural spot to ask about funding in this kind of research. So I assume that the reason so we've got much more knowledge about the area that is potentially going to be mined and the area next to it, and the reason is that there's a economic mechanism to encourage that funding. And so there's a couple of questions that get raised commonly about this. One is just like, how do you think about the necessity of this? Shouldn't we have publicly funded research doing all of this environmental assessment? Because for one thing, should it be a company burden and companies taking that risk? And then also, can we trust the information that comes out of those assessments if they're done by companies? So big questions, but I'm interested in your thoughts on that aspect.
Yeah, look at me. I think that there is an onus on the companies to provide information outside their lease and provide that information to the ISA so that they can make informed regional decisions. But a company's got to be allowed to go into production so they can start earning the revenue to pay for those studies. Because as we said, $10 million a pop, they're not cheap. So absolutely, I think companies are obligated to collect data outside of their lease and provide that to the regulator. But on the question that can you trust the data? Well, as I just explained, the way we set our program up, it's not can you trust TMC, it's can you trust all those institutions that we engaged. I mean, if you don't trust the data that's coming out of those institutions, then you don't trust, a big portion of academia. And
I think that's worth putting some details on. So people talk about there's all this data being produced. A lot of it is available through the ISA has some sort of data portal. And then there's questions of, okay, but if a potential mining company discovers something that they don't want released, wouldn't they just stop that from getting onto the portal? So you're saying that actually this data is collected by third parties, so it's not even necessarily TMC that is in the loop.
Well,
but yeah.
This, a great example of this, Eric, is this whole dark oxygen issue, right? Right? The information that's in that dark oxygen paper was collected over a couple of our campaigns. Mm-hmm. We don't agree with it. We don't agree with the findings. We don't agree that the data that's presented in the paper actually support the findings of the paper. But we had no power to stop it being published, and we wouldn't want to stop it being published. We're challenging it with the journal now. We've got a rebuttal and review with the journal. So that's a perfect example as to why we have no say on how this data that's collected on our campaigns is used, and that's the deal that we had with the academic institutions, because they wouldn't have come on board and worked with us under any other circumstance. So to say you can't trust the data, I think, is very disingenuous.
Interesting. And then what about going forward once mining commences and you have a monitoring program, is that like, do you run that program? Does the company run that program, or is it still the case that there's going to be research institutions interested in coming on board and doing that work?
Well, look, we would absolutely it's part of our long-term plans to, fund ongoing research, and we would absolutely offer places on our vessels to young researchers and universities to come out and collect data. It's in our own interest to, keep this flow of information going. But eventually, what we will have to do is we'll have to train people to do this routine monitoring, because the academic institutions won't want to do that on a regular basis. So we will have to train people, and there'll be lots of opportunities, particularly in the Pacific and the Pacific Islanders, to join our training program so they can be part of this whole monitoring effort that will be ongoing. There's no end to it. As long as you're mining, you have to monitor and report.
And part of that program will be just, I guess I'm imagining how this is going to go. You'll make a impact monitoring plan. You'll submit that to the regulator. The regulator will say, okay, you have to be doing these studies and showing us the results in order to keep your permission kind of active. And so if there's something that you are learning in that information is all going to at least the regulator. And I guess the ISA has some kind of system of making all of the information that they receive public so everybody can use it.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And what will happen eventually is the ISA, the regulator, will have thresholds in place, and they just say, if you are consistently exceeding these thresholds, and that could be, the concentration of your midwater plume, it could be the concentration of metals, whatever, then, you'll be sanctioned for that. And, eventually you could be shut down if you keep violating your permit. So that's why the monitoring and the reporting is so important. That's how the regulator keeps the contractors in check and makes sure that the EMMP is being implemented as it should be.
Okay, so I've a couple of questions left, one of which is just kind of generally. So you're an environmental scientist doing conservation work. Your entire career, you've worked for different organizations. I'm an early career researcher in a research institution where we do a lot of research we do publicly funded research work, and then we do a lot of research for privately funded concerns also. So how do you think about this aspect of producing information for entities that might not want to necessarily learn the things that you're telling them? I don't have a clear question here. Just interested, as someone who's been doing this for an entire career, like, how do you approach this? What advice do you have for people who are maybe considering trying to walk that line?
Yeah, so look, I've spent my whole life basically as trying to talk to engineers basically and say, look, if you do things slightly differently, you'll have better environmental outcomes. And that's a real skill, being able to talk to engineers and talk to designers. And that's why this particular project has really, been a dream of a project to work on, because this has been done the way an EIS should be done. You go out, you collect the data, you collect the environmental information, and then we go to Allseas in Holland and say, well, this is how we want you to change your system to minimize the environmental impacts. And they listened, and they did it. They lowered the return pipe from 1,000 meters to 2,000 meters. They improved how the nozzles on the front of the machine worked. They did all kinds of mitigation measures in the design. That's not how projects normally work. Normally, you're given a design, you say, this is the design, figure out what the environmental impacts are, and then when you figure them out, if there's any significant ones, figure a way of reducing them. But don't change our design because it's all done, right? So that's really frustrating, because, you can, working hydropower dams, for example. I spent many years working on hydropower dams, which are awful for fish passage, right? Fish can't get around them, and you end up building really elaborate fish ladders and fish lifts and everything. Whereas if you'd been part of the design project for the dam, there may have been some other solution that's a lot more elegant, right? But they don't want to listen. So if you can, get to work for a company or get to work with engineers who will actually make you part of the design process and listen to you, that's the way projects should be done, and that's the way to get the best environmental outcome.
Yeah, we're working on that. We pitch that often. If you include us early enough in the design phase, then there's going to be all sorts of positive sum outcomes that we can.
Very rarely happens though.
Well, I think it's often a matter of communication. Also, like we're speaking different languages. When you're talking to engineers, you have to think about what their concerns are and the way that they look at problems. And if you just speak to them in terms of your own concerns and your own environmental aspect, then it seems to me that there's just a breakdown in communication. What about working? Deep sea mining, famously controversial. How is it doing environmental research in the polarized environment?
It can be very frustrating at times because you hear stuff and you read stuff in the media that you just know isn't true, but the media's picking it up and spinning it, and you just think, well, I know that this is wrong and I've got the evidence to prove this is wrong, but yet everybody's repeating it. The great example of this is that's NOAA SmartX paper that came out, right? I've just actually read a comment on LinkedIn about it today. And this one comment really summarized my frustration. So the big thing about that SmartX paper is, as we discussed earlier, is that it showed that within the sedimentation footprint, there was basically recovery. So all of your impact, and even within the tracks, there was some recovery, but all your impacts are confined to the tracks. That was the big take-home message from that paper. Not one of the media releases that I read actually framed it like that. They all said, 40 years after mining, there's still impacts, right?
I'll put links to that paper in the show notes for people who want to understand what you're talking about without having to go. Just give people a picture of what that paper actually is.
So the SmartX paper, so a group of researchers last year went back out to an old mine site called the SmartX site. And this is where they tested a collector over 40 years ago, and a very different design from the ones that we're using today, which have, obviously a lot more technologically advanced. And this collector ran on what we call Archimedes screws. So these are they look like big pontoons either side of the collector vehicle that actually dig into the sediments down to 80 or 90 centimeters, and as they turn, they actually propel the collector vehicle along. And they went back after about 40 years to see what what recovery had happened both in the tracks that this collector vehicle had made, and then also outside the tracks in the sedimentation footprint. So where the sediment had been mobilized and covered nodules. And, as I was saying, the big frustration when I was reading media reports about that paper is that the big message of that paper was that all the impacts after 40 years were contained within the directly mined areas, where these big, Archimedes screws have been churning up the sediment down to 80 centimeters. But outside the directly mined areas, where the sediment had been deposited, on nodules and on the benthic organisms, that completely recovered. That's not the way that paper was portrayed in the press. The headlines were 40 years, still signs of impact at the mining site, which that wasn't the real take-home message from that paper. And, the reason that's frustrating is any mining site, if you go to the Indonesian rainforest and you cut down virgin rainforests, you will not have a climax rainforest after 40 years. That isn't even surprising that within the mining tracks, things went back to the way they were. So things like that frustrate the hell out of me when people should know better.
So I guess another common talking point in the deep sea mining conversation is this comparison between, especially in the context of CCZ, where nickel is one of the main um, uh, economic elements that we're potentially going after, and then the comparison to where nickel is currently being mined, and especially the big push to mine the rainforest of Indonesia. So you have a unique background in that you've looked at both of these things in detail. So I didn't want to let you go until we get your thoughts on kind of how this really compares the nickel mining in the CCZ to nickel mining that takes place in other parts of the world.
That's a great question. I actually watched a documentary on Australian TV called The Great EV Con, and it's by Spotlight. And it only came out about 3 weeks ago, and it's all about dirty nickel in Indonesia. And I would advise anybody who is interested in this topic to watch that. It really exposes what's going on in Indonesia. As we said, I've worked on mines in Indonesia, and one thing that's always concerned me is, and your listeners may not be aware of this, Indonesia is probably the world's most significant biodiversity hotspot. The Wallace Line actually goes through Indonesia. So what we have on the Indonesian archipelago, we have some islands with African-derived organisms on them, such as tigers and rhinoceros and elephants, and then other islands just tens of kilometers away with Australian-derived organisms on them, such as kangaroos and possums. And it's an incredibly diverse area. And because it's made up of islands, even the vegetation amongst the islands is different. And then you put all that in the middle of the coral triangle, right? One of the most significant coral reefs in the world. It is absolutely the last place on Earth you should be mining. So when you look at the species diversity, it was really interesting. A paper came out of the Natural History Museum in 2023, which basically said that they estimated there'd be somewhere between 6,000 to 8,000 metazoan species in the Clarion-Clipperton zone over an area of 4.5 million square kilometers, right? And again, my frustration with how these things are spun, that was, there's thousands of species that were unknown to man in the Clarion-Clipperton zone. This is a terrible place to mine. The same year, a graduate student from Queensland University during COVID released a paper saying that he found 1,000 species in his back garden. He got bored during COVID and just counted all the species in his back garden. So there's a 400 square meter lot of back garden with 1,000 species in it. All of a sudden, 6,000 to 8,000 over 4.5 million square kilometers doesn't sound a lot. And then you compare that to what's going on in Indonesia, where there's 250,000 species estimated in Indonesia, 20% of the global biodiversity. And that's over 2 million square kilometers. So you've got half the area with, 250,000 species in compared to the Clarion-Clipperton zone. So as a conservation biologist, I would say, of course, we should be looking at the abyssal plains as a place to mine. It's even if you just look at it from a numbers game, there's fewer species there. There's more of that habitat type. And we're mining in Wallacea, where there's all kinds of other pressures on the biodiversity, such as palm oil, agriculture. There's people living there. At least look at it. At least consider it, because just from a numbers game, it makes all kinds of sense. That's my take on it.
Well, it's great to get some numbers on that, and I'll eventually get around to interviewing more people with more on the ground knowledge of mining on land. So, but we've kind of run out of time. I'm very aware that people listening to this are going to. Everyone at home is going to have their own questions that they wish I would have asked. But maybe we can do it again another time. So before we sign off, 3 things. First of all, is there anything else that you would like to cover that we didn't get to? Anything else you'd like to mention?
Oh, look, I think we covered everything pretty well there, Eric, in the time we had. It was really good to talk about that trade-off between what's going on in Indonesia and what could be happening in the deep sea, because I think that conversation is, it's not had enough. And a lot of people don't understand what's going on in Indonesia and just how fragile the ecosystems are and the biodiversity is. So I think that was a really good conversation to have.
Then, so secondly, where could you point people to learn more about some of these things? So, where can people follow up with some of these results that you've been releasing? Where do you point people generally if they want to know more about deep sea mining and your operations?
So look, we'll be coming out with a lot of peer-reviewed papers over the next 12 to 18 months as we collect all our data and get it out there. So we will post on our website when we've got new publications due for release. The general information, I find the ISA technical page is really good. They've got a number of technical memos that discuss, some of these issues, such as the impact on fisheries and carbon sequestration. And then there's also the Polymetallic Nodule Research Alliance that have a really good website as well, where you can go and get technical information. So that's where I point people in the first instance.
Oh, great. That's great. Yeah. And then, finally, where do people follow you? Are you active on social media?
Yeah, look, I've got a LinkedIn page. Occasionally, I may make comments when things really rile me up on various papers or comments. So, yeah, you can follow me on LinkedIn or follow the Metals Company as well for the latest updates on what we're up to.
Great. Okay, well then, Michael Clarke, thanks again for all of your time today.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it.